scary story fanatics. Welcome back to this year's 13 Days of Halloween. And boy, do we have a Kickstarter for you today. So sit down, relax, and get ready for a book exclusive that none have heard before. A little story that I like to call The Birth of Vengeance.
Mary's life was simple and plain, much like herself. Subsequently, Mary spent much of her time alone, sad and isolated from her peers. She never did have many friends, and the ones that she did have eventually abandoned her for a chance at increased social status. Mary was quiet and kept to herself. She was treated by those around her like a monster. Even at home, there was no respite. Her mother had died during childbirth, and her father worked nights, with lots of overtime. She was just as alone at home as anywhere else. So Mary began to take interest in hobbies that one can enjoy by their lonesome, specifically day hiking in the nearby Bethlehem forest. She never wandered far, for fear of getting lost. She'd heard the rumors in town. A creature, not human, spotted lurking in those very woods, which caused most of the townfolk to steer clear. But that's what she liked about it so much. The peacefulness of being alone, not feeling the hatred of others and the need to be one of them. She wasn't afraid of myths and monsters. Logic and rationale had deemed these things fanciful and silly, the machinations of contorted minds that cannot withstand the unknown. However, the more Mary frequented Bethlehem, the more acquainted with the layout of the land that she had become, the further and further she would press. Soon she wandered in so deep that the forest seemed to dim, the canopy above too thick for sunlight to effectively pervade, and the forest itself seemed to open up, like she had stepped into some kind of illuminated cavernous chamber of flora and detritus. It somehow seemed to contrast the landscape that she recently traversed, but in a way that Mary could not yet identify. Mary took a few more steps inward, ducking just before a small twig protruding from one of the tree trunks that almost poked her in the eye. As she stood back upright, she realized it. The apparent contrast now floating to the surface of relevance. The passage so far was obstructive, as one may perceive. The lack of a beaten path, an unabated growth of flora, and the various twigs she had stooped to avoid. But this was the last one that she could detect for as far as her eyes would allow through the thick vegetation, because no more dead branches extended from the respective trunks, only stubs from where they had been broken off. The whole current landscape had been cleared, the low-hanging branches removed, lending to that appearance of a gray, vacant chamber. The shrubbed and moss-covered forest floor was even sporadic here, separated by wide lanes of nothing but earth and leaves. These were paths. Once this construct had landed heavy in Mary's mind. The encumbrance of it held her trepidation at bay, but only for a moment. Realization was now being washed away by fear and the looming presence of overwhelming dread. There were no prints in the dirt to indicate the type of creature that frequented here, human or otherwise, and thoughts of the town's myths and legends soon entered her thoughts. Rationale and a logical mind, however, pressed her onward, as Mary conceived that maybe someone lived nearby, or hunted here, with there being a path on the other side heading into some unknown isolated abode. More curious now than fearful, Mary decided to explore the area and these walkways in hopes of discovering the reason for their presence, assuming their purpose to be benign. Eventually, the more she walked, the more that each path converged into each other until coalescing into a single trail. More assured than ever that these would lead her to a home or a hunting shack, Mary pressed on, but She was soon perplexed when the trail ended at the base of a large oak tree. In front of her, on the moss-covered side of the trunk, resided a large crevice in the wood, as if two trees had grown into one, and the aperture was large enough to accommodate a crouching, full-sized adult. Curious as to what kind of animal called this place home, Mary drew cautiously closer to inspect the area for relevant clues. Darkness beyond was all that could be detected, and no paw prints had been made in the earth at its base, lending no evidence that there was anything here at all. Mary stopped at the clear sound of some unnatural hiss, as if whatever was making it was sort of inhaling the air, slurping it in for some unknown purpose. Mary began to back away, never breaking gaze with the opening as she did. As a result, she didn't miss a detail when a thick, snake-like object wormed out from the darkness and onto the side of the tree, like some sort of tentacle appendage. However, as the rest of the monstrous form emerged, she saw that's exactly what it was. For a fraction of a second later, in the same motion, an identical snake-like arm reached out, gripping the other side of the gaping, wooden maw, just before the rest of its body emerged from the darkness within. Each tentacled limb led back to an almost wooden, insect-like body trunk, black and brown in appearance. Its legs, of which there were two, were more like sticks, long, rigid, and thin, ending in dual-clawed digits that haunched backwards like a kangaroo. Its head, however, was the most horrifying thing that she'd ever seen. Monstrous with no nose, no hair, large teeth, and two black eyes darker than the deepest chasms known to man. The way this thing stood upright seemed to almost mimic human posture, and the sight all amalgamated together into something more surreal than her mind could handle. Mary screamed and turned to run. In her haste to flee, however, her foot caught on a stone set firm in the dirt, and her body toppled forward. Mary slammed into the ground with force, and as she scrambled to her feet, her blurry vision with panic, a distinct, sniffling noise began emanating from behind her. Standing now, she turned to look, but still backed away. She saw a curious sight that confused her at first, not understanding what was happening. That rigid and tentacled creature sat low to the ground, crouching, and was cradling its head in its snake-like arms, inhaling deeply, with sobbing releases. It took Mary's brain a moment to catch up. The show on display before her was so far outside her schematic norm that her thoughts struggled for semblance. Soon, though, her cognition found some sort of equilibrium, comprehension, washing over her like a waking dawn. This thing was crying. She should have turned once again to flee, to make her escape, but something held her in place, even nudged her towards the monstrosity. It was empathy. Mary recognized the pain in those sorrowful black eyes. She could feel the crestfallen emotion pouring out of this being as if it were her own. It was isolation, the feeling of loneliness. Mary understood this emotion all too well and found the urge to comfort the creature impossible to resist. After all, if she couldn't save herself from a long-standing feeling of loneliness, maybe she could help someone or something else. Incidentally, Mary approached the creature, extending a hand outward in a gentle manner. The creature tilted its head slightly upward, jerked at Mary's approaching hand, and scuttled backward a few inches with a hiss, much like a frightened cat would. This gave Mary a momentary reservation in extending and reaching towards this thing again, but the insurmountable, powerful sadness expressed by this thing's face prompted her to try once again. And this time she succeeded. As soon as she touched it, the creature somehow seemed to calm, and Mary marveled at how contrastingly soft yet rigid this thing's skin felt to the touch. Are you okay? Are you like me?" she asked, as if it were going to respond back at her. The thing outreached the closest of its tentacled limbs towards her and wrapped the distal end of it over her left shoulder, carefully caressing her firm yet gentle, mimicking her actions. "Ormuz," the thing quietly hissed from between its sharp teeth, and Mary found herself astounded at hearing this thing speak. Astonishment quickly turned into excitement. What else could she teach him? She assumed it to be a hymn based on its body structure, anatomy unconcealed by clothing, and the somewhat baritone pitch behind its hissing voice. Mary spent hours that day, and many days after that, with the creature, teaching it about language and the world outside of the forest. Much of what she said stood as nothing more than the testament to confusion. Constructs such as work, economy, the internet, and other modern amenities made no empirical sense to it, but each day that she would return, a noticeable excitement for Mary's presence was obvious. This creature had begun to enjoy Mary's company just as much as she enjoyed it. Soon, he was speaking in full sentences, primitively explaining the best that he could about his origins of being birthed in darkness, how he lived underground, and his uncertainties of various elements that Mary had no reference for, foreign to her concepts of civilized life. But despite all of the incongruencies between them, they soon became best friends. Short afternoons blossomed into entire days together. She had taught him rudimentary speech in English, and he expressed compassion and enthusiasm at her companionship. It wasn't long after that companionship grew into something more, and entire days together began to include nights as well. However, Mary still lived at home, and despite being a complete loner, her long absences had drawn the attention of her father. Her disheveled appearance grabbed the focus of school officials, and the walks into the tree line of Bethlehem Forest seized the notice of her peers who had no benign intentions in mind. Her father, of course, questioned her, asking her where she had been going, and when telling him, "Nowhere, just spending time in the woods alone," he didn't believe her. School faculty expressed concern as well, but more out of institutional duty in opposition to actual caring. They had, as required by law, brought Mary's disposition and personal neglect to the attention of child welfare services, but upon inspection of the home, they found no cause for alarm and closed the case. Afterward, the school dropped the issue, having done their job. Mary's peers, however, were fueled by differing perspectives and motivators than concerned parents or a dutiful educational system. They didn't merely desire to ascertain the truth of where she had been going each time that she'd entered the forest. They wanted ammunition to add to their stereotypes, verbal insults, and belittling. The intrinsic value of self-satisfaction regarding the torment of others supersedes that of obligation, and where the adults in Mary's life had fallen short, that slack would be picked up by her inconsiderate classmates. On a dreary afternoon, Mary was unknowingly pursued beyond the tree line of Bethlehem Forest. By the time that Mary had reached her secret grotto in the forest that Saturday afternoon, the sun above the canopy was shining high above in the sky, cascading beams of light that filtered through the leaves and needles above. Mary unstrapped the backpack from her shoulders and set the bag on the ground nearby the old gnarled oak tree. Slowly, a shape emerged from the hole at its base, and once seeing it was Mary, his apprehension again subsided, and he quickened his pace at moving to greet her. The two locked in an embrace, holding each other tight in tentacles and arms, faces interlocked. A second later, Mary and her companion heard something that heightened their senses and pumped adrenaline through their veins. The light snap of a twig nearby. Hoping to only find some deer or rabbit walking through the forest, Mary turned her head. Fear filled her exponentially until terror and dread were all that remained. Behind the bramble and wide trunks of nearby trees was a trio of boys that Mary recognized all too well. These boys were bullies of the worst kind, used to getting their way. Still holding on to him, she stood frozen, staring as the boys slowed to a halt at sight that they were now beholding. "What the fuck is that thing?" The tall one in the middle, wearing the school's colors on his jacket, said, "Don't worry, Mary, we'll save you," another shorter and muscular kid said out loud. "What is this shit?" the last one replied, also tall but thin and gaunt. Mary yelled out to them, her silence now broken in an attempt to save her only friend, but the rage in their eyes and sickening smiles on their faces led her to believe that their intentions would not be abated so easily. Mary stepped towards the trio, but was instantly pushed to the ground by the one wearing his varsity jacket. Mary began to sob, knowing that she alone would be powerless to stop what was about to transpire. By the time she had gotten to her feet, her strange friend was already on the ground with the boy who had pushed her over on top of him, punching him as hard as he could. The creature hissed and howled, but his attacker only responded with widening eyes, a sinister smile, and more relentless pummeling. Mary screamed and rushed at the boy, who was now killing her friend, beating him to death. She leapt through the air and latched onto his back, swinging her fists furiously, doing all that she could. But the two boys that stood by and watched, laughing, grabbed a hold of Mary on either side by her arms and pulled her off of their friend and refused to let her go. Mary was forced to witness the slow and agonizing death of the only creature that she'd ever felt that truly understood her. She was forced to listen to the crack of every bone, the pained screams and pleading whimpers that had screeched like a wounded baby, and the raspy, gurgled final breath that had exhaled just before the boy stood from the creature, and his two lackeys released Mary. Before they had left, they told her that she should thank them later before laughing to each other, gloating how no one would believe that they had just killed the Betham Forest monster, giving each other high fives and chuckling amongst one another until out of sight, leaving Mary alone to bend over her friend with a desperate hope that he might still be alive. Try as she might, his black eyes remained rolled over white. His jaw hung slack and dislocated to the side, and his thin, lanky frame was completely unmoving. Her friend was dead. Lonely days turned into crestfallen weeks, eventually accumulating into months of solitude and sadness. Mary's classmates indeed told as many as they could of that day, but no one ever believed them, or their story. No body was ever found because Mary, through watery and blurry eyes, painstakingly hid it by burying the corpse where no one would ever find it. Mary's father continued to work nights and still never paid much attention to his daughter, but that was okay, Mary thought. No one seemed to notice the rapid distension of her abdomen or her cravings for odd food combinations. Maybe it was due to the nature of unknown genetics or something else entirely, unable to be measured by science. But it had only been 5 months. However, she knew that it would come any day now. No one appeared to realize the implications that now grew exponentially in her uterus. But Mary did. And the name that she had picked out served all that it implied. She would name her baby, whatever it was, Vengeance.
I simply love Halloween, so I figured why not just start the marathon off with a good old-fashioned love story, one as old as time, a girl meets ghoul, so to speak. But if you sure like this story, you're certainly going to like the next, so make sure you stop in for night 2 of this horror extravaganza. I do love a good romance with a decapitation.
Social media can be very unpredictable, especially regarding horror content. If this content gets removed, all new content will be simultaneously presented on various websites provided in the description to this video. Make sure to follow me in other digital spaces so that you never miss out on the terror. Also, If you like this video, make sure to leave a comment and hit the like button. It helps the channel a lot. If you're new to the channel and you enjoy what's here, consider hitting that subscribe button and the notification bell so that you never miss an upload. Writing is a dream of mine, and it's all of you that make that dream come true.